Well, thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to see you and Kathy. You guys have been long-term friends, and I want to say good morning to all of your chapter folk. It's been a while since I've been to Chicago, but it's nice to see everybody up and at the meeting. What I'd like to talk to you about today is as Bob mentioned, I'm on the staff scholar team at RTB, and I'm kind of the oddball in that I'm the only non-scientist. So today I'm going to talk to you about ideas. I want to talk to you about two terms that the Germans have. One is called a Weltanschauung, and the other is called a Zeitgeist. Germans have these very interesting terms. The word for tank in the German language is 35 letters long, and they shorten it to Panzer. But I want to talk to you about ideas, and I'm going to try to tie together what's happening in our world now and relate it to the importance of testing ideas and education. So let me begin. I think all of us recognize the extraordinary events of 2020 have left many people wondering if we're living in a new era. I mean, I don't think any of us have seen anything like a pandemic. I mean, you can go back to 1918, the very year my father was born, but here a virus that you can't see with the naked eye has largely brought not only the United States, but really the world to kind of a halt. And I think that the lockdowns and things like that have left people feeling rather isolated. And then things have happened in our country. The George Floyd situation there in Minneapolis, where he died in the custody of police. And then things that have flown from that, cultural unrest. We've seen all kinds of protests, some legal, some very illegal. And so I want to try to tie some of these ideas together. So what significant ideas, beliefs, and values are uniquely reflected in our present cultural climate? And that kind of brings us to this German word. The Germans have a special philosophical term for such reflection. It's called a Zeitgeist. It means the spirit of the age, drawn from the German word Zeit, meaning time, and Geist, meaning spirit. It refers to what philosophers call the general intellectual, moral, and cultural atmosphere of a given time period. Now, as I work through these ideas, if you have a question, I want you to make a little note of it, because when I'm done, I want to give as much time to you to your question. So if something sparks in your mind, just note it so that we can come back to it. Now, I'd like to give you kind of a snapshot of the way kind of philosophers look at different eras. I want to talk about briefly, and by the way, all of this is either in my book, A World of Difference, or it is in an article that I wrote for Reflections about education and propaganda. But let me introduce very briefly three kind of meta-narratives, worldviews, if you will. One is pre-modernism, two is modernism, and three is postmodernism. And I'm going to compare them. Let's begin with pre-modernism. This would be the ancient world. This would reflect all the way down to the time of the Renaissance. Christianity is a pre-modern belief system. What does that mean? Well, the objective foundation for truth, meaning, and value are found in God. So there is objective truth. There's truth outside of us. There is truth that we can potentially discover, but the foundation for that truth, meaning, and value is found in God. God is the creator of the world. He is truth himself. In fact, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. So Christians believe in objective truth. There's not truth for you and truth for me. There's truth. And meaning and value are found in God. We're made in the image of God. Therefore, we have inherent dignity and moral worth. To murder people, whether it be the unborn or anyone else, is morally objectionable. And so this idea would reflect that there is truth, meaning, and value in the world, and God is the one who grounds that. Now, as we move to number 2, paradigms began to change right about the time of the Enlightenment. And that's like 1700s, if you will. Europe is moving in a secular direction away from its kind of foundational Christian values. Well, modernism would say that there is objective truth, but the objective truth foundation for truth, meaning, and value are found in human beings, found in nature, found in science. So the modernist perspective shifted to more of a secular view that truth can be found in the individual person or in nature or in science, but not necessarily grounded in God. Now, the third one, in which I think we'll spend the most of our time kind of referencing, is what we call postmodernism. So if pre-modernism, it reflects prior to the 1700s, and if modernism began sometime in the 1700s, I would say pre-modernism began about the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. So about 1989. We have what we know as postmodernism. Now, these ideas have always been around in one shape or another. But with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we kind of have a new paradigm. And it's postmodern. The objective foundation for truth, meaning, and values does not exist. There is no objective truth. There is only truth that you can have for yourself. And therefore, truth is changing, it's relative, morality is relative, and the best we can have is kind of building a consensus. Now let's go a step further here. If we think of a worldview as like a pair of glasses or a prism, right? I have a pair of sunglasses, and I look through the lens, and it takes a lot of the excessive light away. A good pair of glasses will bring you closer to reality. A defective pair of glasses will take you away from reality. But take a look at these two prisms. Christians historically and classically have talked about truth, goodness, and beauty. Truth, goodness, and beauty. Now, all of those are grounded in God. God is the truth. And if you discover truth in science, you're getting a little closer to God. You discover truth in history, philosophy. God is the author of 2 books, the book of Scripture and the book of nature. The book of nature is a figurative book, and it includes the natural world. So Christians, when they have talked about the world or look through the prism, we see truth, goodness, and beauty. And God is the author of truth, and God is the author of goodness. He is also the author of beauty. Now, the secular postmodern prism that we see so much today, and especially since the time of the 1980s, they don't look at the world through the prism of truth, goodness, and beauty. Secular postmodernism largely looks at the world through race, gender, and class. Now, that doesn't mean Christianity doesn't have a lot to say about those subjects. Because I could tell you, for example, in Galatians chapter 5, the Apostle Paul lays down a revolutionary statement. He says there's no difference between Jew, Gentile, slave, free, male, female. All are one in Christ. And I can't tell you how radical that statement is. Because in the ancient world, in the Roman Empire, the Romans were the only ones with rights. Women had no rights. Non-Romans had no rights. fact, the two largest people groups to join Christianity were women and slaves. Why not? Jesus comes and says that God loves you. He sent his son into the world to die for you, to reconcile you. You're made in the image of God, whether regardless of your race, gender, class, place of origin, health, you are made in the image of God, and you can become the child of God by being adopted into the family, by trusting Christ as your Savior. And so Christians have been at the forefront of abolishing slavery. Christians have been at the forefront of protecting people who are marginalized. Even the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Martin Luther King would frequently quote the minor prophets of the Old Testament. Why? Because Yahweh cares about the people on the margin. He cares about widows. He cares about orphans. He cares about immigrants. And so there has always been a context of Christianity caring about what we might say is social justice. And yet the secular postmodern position would say, look, there is no objective truth. And so your identity is not being made in the image of God. Your identity is in your specific race or your gender. We might say sex instead of gender because there are all these gender debates, or it's your class. And largely the secular postmodern position would tell you that there's two types of people in the world. The people who oppress and the people who are being oppressed. Now, what I want to focus on in our time together is where some of these ideas have come from. And it is my view that what happens in the world is that ideas really rule the world. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that because philosophers don't make a lot of money. They talk a lot about ideas. But in many ways, ideas really rule the world. Now, when I look at my 401k the last few months, I'm thinking maybe I should have been a banker rather than a philosopher. But in reality, no. I really do think ideas rule the world. And I think ideas begin in our educational system and they flow down into culture and into reality. So for a generation or so, at the university, they have been debating these ideas of postmodern thought. But we're now starting to see the fruit of those postmodern thinking. And for some of us, we think that fruit doesn't taste very good. So what I'd like to do is to share a little bit about how I think education is fundamentally different than what we know as propaganda. And the backdrop of all of this is, again, that secular postmodern context. So there's a lot of discussion these days about things like fake news, right? This is an election year. And we have two candidates, and there's discussion that depending on what cable channel you listen to or what news program, maybe you're getting fake news. Maybe people are artificially creating ideas or distorting ideas. We have claims of yellow journalism, and we talk a lot about political propaganda. I'm old enough to remember 1968. 1968 seemed to me to be a time of unrest. I remember Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were killed just months apart. And it was the height of the Vietnam War and lots of protest and unrest. There were streets in America that were burning. It was a very, very difficult time. And it was, of course, an election year, and Lyndon Johnson decided he would not run. And ultimately, Richard Nixon won. Well, some of the ideas even then can be compared to today. Now, there's also a lot of attention given to whether public schools and colleges in our time educate or indoctrinate when it comes to the instruction of their students. Could I propose, for example, that a lot of people have been indoctrinated in our schools and colleges in a postmodern context? And this is challenging in many ways. Now, many of you are very interested in science. That's probably why you're a Christian and you're interested in science, and so RTB is a pretty good fit for you. Well, who do we allow to sit at the table? A lot of times ideas are marginalized. I think the RTB position is marginalized. On one side, we have the young earth creationists. They're pretty uneasy at times about reasons to believe. They think that we give too much sway to science. Then on the other hand, there are evolutionary creationists or theistic evolutionists. And they criticize RTB because we don't accept evolution. Well, who gets a seat at the table, so to speak? Well, a lot of people think that today in our public schools and in our colleges, you have a very postmodern secular mindset. And that has to do with things like relativism. And they talk a lot about race, gender, and class, and little about truth, goodness, and beauty. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea of how education in a classical context is very different than propaganda. And I want to look at 7 ways that I think education differs from propaganda. So let me go further. Before we look at those 7 ways, I think we need to do a little defining of our terms. What do we mean by education? What do we mean by indoctrination? And what do we mean by propaganda? Well, I would define education this way. Education is the pursuit and discovery of information, knowledge, truth, and wisdom through critical analysis. That process of discovery can be unaided, self-study. You can just go to the library and read books, or it can be aided. You can have teachers. The goal of education is for the student to develop the ability to form an independent, reasonable judgment of the topic studied. That's really important. Education's goal is for the student to develop the ability to form an independent, reasonable judgment of the topic studied. In other words, education is to help the student to learn how to think, not cramming down their throat ideas from other people. Education is to help that student to develop an independent judgment. Now, how does that differ from indoctrination? Indoctrination can mean mere instruction in a given topic, but often it carries the pejorative meaning of inculcating ideas in an uncritical manner. Now, education is always going to have some indoctrination. I mean, even if I were talking with you today, I'm giving you ideas of classical Christianity. I'm talking about the Christian worldview. So indoctrination can mean communicating information, but largely now it's become inculcating ideas in an uncritical manner. I mean, even when I catechized my children, when I educated my children, and a couple of my kids were homeschooled for a period of time, I would introduce challenges and ideas. I would tell them about evolution. I would tell them arguments that the atheist would present. I wanted them to think critically, not just Christianly. I wanted them to think critically. And so we'd go back and forth. Now, indoctrination. This approach to teaching can be well-intentioned, but from an educational standpoint, it is ultimately not in the best interest of the student because it lacks the necessary critical analysis. Indoctrination stands closer to propaganda than to education. Now, propaganda, what is that? Propaganda involves the dissemination of information, including biased and misleading information, to get someone to accept a particular agenda. often of a political nature. Propaganda is worse than well-intentioned indoctrination because it intentionally seeks to manipulate a person into accepting a specific viewpoint or ideology. So if you hold a postmodern perspective and you can't really have objective truth, then everybody has an agenda. The world is a world of power plays. And people are trying to get their ideas across. And particularly if you have totalitarian states, I mean, the Nazis were masters of propaganda. Joseph Goebbels was the secretary of the propaganda. And I want to note something about World War II, if I could. Some of you might be familiar with a man named Albert Speer. Speer was a very close associate of Hitler. In fact, Speer was an architect and Hitler was an art student. And so Hitler kind of got Speer to help develop, you know, when the Germans won the war, they were going to build Germania. And Speer would be the one that would give the architectural structure for the German nation. Well, Speer in his book, Inside the Third Reich, says that he was caught up in the Nazi movement. He said, you know, I was trained in the university. He said, what I should have done is I should have read Mein Kampf. I should have read Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century. And he said, if I would have done that, I would have discovered in the early 30s that Hitler's goal was not only to rule the world, but to exterminate all the Jews of Europe. He said, if I would have just followed the educational principles, but he said I didn't. I was caught up into the propaganda of Nazi Germany. And by the way, Speer was called by none other than Winston Churchill the most important Nazi. Why? Because as the war went on, Hitler took Speer out of his plan of building Germania and made him Secretary of Armaments and Munitions. And Speer was so effective at meeting the military goals of the German army that Churchill said because of Speer's expertise, World War II lasted 2 years longer than it should have. So here is a world figure who is caught up in propaganda. What I think that tells us is any of us could be caught up in propaganda. We have to be very critical in our ideas. Well, let's go forward. I'm then going to propose 7 ways that education, what I'm calling analytical discovery, differs from propaganda, which I'm calling manipulative persuasion. Well, a good education strives to incorporate the following 7 ideals, practices, virtues, whereas propaganda denies, ignores, or limits them. The first one, what I'm going to call the how rather than the what. Education emphasizes how to think instead of telling you what to think. I think that's just so important. Education emphasizes how to think instead of just shoving down your throat. Here is our particular worldview. Could I say, I think for the last 40 or 50 years, in our elite universities, students have been taught particular things about the nation, about the founding of our nation, about the political leaders that forged our nation. And so I think that in our educational system, students are often taught what to think rather than how to think. Genuine learning requires developing critical thinking skills that can aid the student in analysis and evaluation in order to form, again, a reasonable judgment of a given topic. So, you know, when I was teaching at colleges and universities, I didn't think it was my goal to tell the students all of my opinions about what were true. I thought it was my goal to help them to be able to form a reasonable judgment of a given topic. Here's Princeton professor Robert P. George. Some of you may be familiar with George. He is professor of law and political philosophy. He is a Roman Catholic by conviction. I think he was a pro-life individual working in the George Bush administration. Listen to what George says. He says, "Why can't people understand the difference and the importance of the difference between education, good, and indoctrination, bad? This is not hard. It is not a fine line. Teaching young people how to think carefully, critically, is different from telling them what to think." And you know, our Ivy League schools, these are elite schools. I think the youngest of the Ivy League is the one in New York. Slipped my mind. Anyway, all of these schools, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Brown, University of Pennsylvania, these began with a Christian charter. But today, virtually all of these schools have a very strong political correctness, a very kind of postmodern idea. So here's George talking about the difference between teaching how to think instead of what to think. A good education prepares students to develop the necessary skills to learn to think for themselves. Propaganda tells a person exactly what to think. You know, again, there's always going to be some indoctrination. When I was teaching my children, I taught them about the Trinity. I taught them about the incarnation, the atonement, the resurrection. But I also taught my kids, you know, that there are other people in the world who don't agree with these things. And they're going to challenge these things. But I wanted my kids, and I certainly want my students at the university, to think for themselves. That's a very different, there's a real difference between propaganda and education there. All right. Number two, objectivity over subjectivity. Education pursues objectivity instead of subjectivity. But of course, secular postmodernism says there is no objectivity. We're lost in a subjective world. There is no objectivity. A solid approach to education, a solid approach to learning, acknowledges the challenge of human bias and prejudice and seeks to promote a reasonable open-mindedness and even-handedness and a basic fairness when considering issues. So all of us as human beings, we have limitations, we have boundaries, we have prejudices, we have biases, but a good education is to try to help you to be more open-minded, more even-handed, a basic fairness. You may not change your ultimate perspective, but as Aristotle said, the sign of an educated person is that they can consider a belief even if they don't happen to personally hold it. I think that's a powerful sign of education. Education usually serves to broaden one's perspective. Propaganda is an agenda-driven, focuses upon the subjective goals of persuasion, and tends to significantly narrow one's perspective. I think our universities, by and large, are narrowing perspectives rather than broadening perspectives. Now, let me introduce you to a place that you probably know pretty well. In 2011, the University of Chicago took a very bold and a very courageous stand. The University of Chicago said that we're not going to buy into a lot of the propaganda-driven ideas. We're not going to have safe spaces for our students. We're going to challenge our students even if the ideas that they're presented make them feel very uncomfortable. And so the report of the Committee on the Freedom of Expression came out of the University of Chicago, which has a very rich history in education, a great books program. One of my favorite philosophers and educators is Mortimer Jerome Adler, who wrote the book, How to Read a Book. And when I read that book for the first time, I discovered I didn't know how to read very well. Well, Adler was at the University of Chicago in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they developed a great books program. So I'm going to quote from the University of Chicago. Here's what the University of Chicago says about the freedom of debate. This is from the report on the Committee of Freedom of Expression. It says this, and I find it really refreshing. The university has a solemn responsibility not only to promote a lively and fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect that freedom when others attempt to restrict it. You know, could I tell you, if I was the president of a university and a Nazi wanted to give a presentation, I wouldn't shout him down. I would say, you know, give your presentation of National Socialism, but recognize that when you're done, we're going to take it apart. If you're going to present it, you better be ready to defend it. And if the communists, the Marxists wanted to come and give a presentation, I wouldn't shut them down. I would say, you're welcome. But remember, when you give the presentation, you're going to have to defend it, and we're going to attempt to take it apart. I think that's what an education should be. An education should make you feel uncomfortable. And I think that's true of Christians as well. Ideas sometimes make you uncomfortable. I think the University of Chicago was right in 2011 when they made the statement. They were way ahead of our elite Ivy League schools that don't have freedom of debate. Now, number three, a third difference between education and propaganda has to do with controversies. Education introduces controversies, that is, disagreements, instead of shielding from them. One of the concerns I have about the young earth view, and again, I know a lot of Christians who are young earthers. I know a lot of very intelligent, thoughtful, reflective Christians who are young earth creationists. And, you know, some of them will come to me and say, Ken, the death before the fall, I just can't see it. And, you know, I say to them, look, I think in Romans 5, when Paul's talking about death, he's not talking about animal death, he's talking about human death. And I try to make a case that you could have predation in the world prior to the fall. But sometimes they say, look, Ken, I just can't buy it. And I say, well, look, you need to follow your conscience before the Word of God. But before you embrace young earth creationism, I hope you will look at the best presentations on the other side. But I think the challenge that young earth creationism has is you have some really bright kids in some of these families, and then they go to the university and they're introduced to all these disagreements and controversies, and it can overwhelm them. An education is intended to make you feel uncomfortable. And you kind of have to prepare your kids for that. And if you go to an elite school and you tell them the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and the reigning paradigm is, no, it's not. And not only do we live in an ancient universe, but humans are the product of blind, mechanistic, natural processes. Education makes people feel uncomfortable. And that's a good thing. Discovering genuine knowledge and truth about life in the world is seldom without controversy and disagreement among people. That's life. Ideas conflict. People disagree. That's part of the human condition. A good learning environment exposes students to the general and important differences concerning topics and perspectives. Propaganda selectively shields people from controversies. Not a good thing. Let me quote the former president of the University of Chicago, Hannah Holborn Gray. Again, you can go on the web, report of the Committee on Freedom of Expression. She said this, she says, education should not be intended to make people comfortable. It is meant to make them think. Wow. Education is not intended to make people comfortable. It's meant to make them to think. Universities should be expected to provide the conditions within which have thought and therefore strong disagreement, independent judgment, and the question of stubborn assumptions can flourish in an environment of the greatest freedom. That doesn't happen a lot today. And we've had students being taught things for an entire generation. And now to some extent, we're seeing those ideas filter down into society. A fourth way education differs is that education examines both sides instead of just one side. When topics are divided between viable positions, a good model of education exposes students to fair-minded discussion of both sides of a controversial issue. You know, when I teach ethics at Biola University or at a public college here in Southern California, you know, I'll often give them a term paper they have to write about an ethical issue. And you know, some of the Christians may take a pro-life view, or they might write on capital punishment, or they might write on war, whatever ethical issue they're interested in. I say, yep, that sounds like a good one. But I want to make sure that after you make your case for the pro-life view, or for maybe a just war view, or whatever it may be, I want you to tell me at the end of your paper, what is the best argument on the other side against your view, and how you would respond to it. And, you know, I have students come back to me often and they say, you know, I didn't know that there are some ideas over there that are rather formidable. A good education is going to expose you to those ideas. Again, propaganda tends to be manipulatively one-sided in perspective. You only get one side. I'm very concerned that students, not only at our universities, but in our public schools, they get one side. And therefore, they're not being educated. They're being propagandized. They're being indoctrinated. I think a school should be a clash of ideas. But for 40 years, our kids have been taught particular things, one-sided. Here's another quote from the University of Chicago, freedom of speech. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. I love that. A university in a classroom should be a place where people get ideas and they have to field them, and sometimes they'll make you feel very uncomfortable. But that's what education is about. The report continues, although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. You know, if you take the founding fathers of America, and you look at someone like Washington or Jefferson or Adams, and you look at their ideas, and you go back and forth, and you look at the, you look at the Constitution, you look at the Bill of Rights, and then you also look at the lives of these individuals. Some of them owned slaves, some did not. Adams, for example, was wealthy enough to have had a number of slaves, but he didn't because he thought it was wrong. Washington owned slaves, but he also intended for them to be freed once he and his wife had passed away. I think any kind of presentation of the founding fathers would include their the good with the not so good, the good with the bad. But today we have, kind of the cancel culture. Somebody wrote to me recently about Jonathan Edwards, the great Christian thinker. In fact, lots of people think Jonathan Edwards is arguably the greatest philosophical thinker the United States of America has ever produced. Edwards, of course, lived during the Great Awakening, wrote a book about it, an extraordinary theologian. But there are some people who would suggest now that you really don't want to read Jonathan Edwards because he was not anti-slavery. And so a lot of times we're given one perspective rather than, I mean, what do we have here, Bob? 23 people, 24 with me. How many of you, if you were born in the 1700s, would stand up against slavery? I hope you would. But how many people here are people who are broken and wounded and scarred by sin? The Christian perspective says we're all made in the image of God and have inherent dignity and moral worth. But the fall says that we have been enslaved by sin. I'm concerned that we don't have what the University of Chicago says we should have, and that is a rigorous debate of ideas. Let's go further. Number 5, education reviews strengths and weaknesses, pros and cons, instead of just one or the other. Proposed solutions to problems can be controversial and usually involve potentially strengths and weaknesses. I don't know any view that doesn't have strengths and weaknesses. The reasons to believe old earth creation model has strengths and weaknesses. That's the way we kind of look at things. A fair-minded approach to learning gets into the practice of examining both the pros and the cons of a position. Genuine learning involves knowing both strengths and weaknesses of a viewpoint. Propaganda, on the other hand, is all about persuasion. Thus, the focus is exclusively on either the strengths or the weaknesses. You know, again, I'm old enough to kind of remember, I think in the 1960s, when I watched the news with my dad, and we would watch CBS News with Walter Cronkite, and God forbid that you talked if my dad was watching the news. Now, I think Walter Cronkite was coming from a politically liberal point of view. But I think Cronkite and others thought that as journalists, they had an obligation to try to be fair-minded. That they were not opinion makers, they were giving straight news. Now, did they always achieve their ideal goal of being fair-minded? Probably not. But today we have big challenges when it comes to the ideas of journalists. And so we live in a world where we have to really search for the truth. Let me put it to you this way. When I was a kid, if I wanted information, I had a problem of access. I had to go to the library. I was grateful that my parents would buy, we had a set of encyclopedias, and there were things that my parents had in the house that kind of encouraged my thinking and reading. But the problem when I was a kid is getting access to the information. Then in the late 90s, the whole new world of the internet took over. And now the difference is not a problem of access, because you have at your fingertips, virtually anything, any information you want about anything. But now the question is, can I trust the content of it? So I've gone from a period where I had a challenge to try to get at the information. Now the challenge is, how much of it is really trustworthy? How much of it can I discern? Number 6, intellectual inquiry. Education promotes honest intellectual inquiry instead of deception. A proper education stresses the critical importance of the virtue of honesty at every stage of the learning process. In education, ideas are prized and therefore treated with integrity. Manipulation and deception are hallmarks of propaganda and are never acceptable. Again, the honesty. Think about science. So the scientist is looking at the data. He's developed a hypothesis. He is trying to falsify it. He develops his ideas. How important is it for the scientist to be critically honest, not fudge data? How important is it in the world of ideas to prize integrity? I think one way of really being a good witness for Christ is that your family members and your neighbors and the people you work with and go to school with, that they know something about you. They know that you are painfully honest, that you won't miscommunicate things. I think that's a very powerful Christian witness. By the way, I also think another Christian witness is having a really good work ethic. Because if you work in a business, everybody in that business knows who works and who doesn't. And if you work really hard, somebody's going to come up to you and say, what explains your work ethic? Where did you get the fire in the belly? Sometimes I think it is those basic ideas that set people apart. If you're a truth teller, if you're a person who prizes truth, you're careful, you're honest, you're hardworking. I think those things set people apart. You don't want to be manipulative and deceptive. That's propaganda. Number 7, our last point, education encourages dialogue instead of monologue. Learning is enhanced by respectful dialogue, discussion, and interaction. Learning under multiple voices is often superior to learning on one voice, as in propaganda. A good education, either aided, unaided, or aided, can provide the critical tools to help students gain knowledge, truth, and wisdom. My kids are now adults. My oldest daughter, now I got to do a little math in my head. She is 33. And my other daughter is 29 and my son is 25. So they're all adults. If I had to do it all over again, would I send them to the public schools? Or would I send them to a charter school? Would I homeschool them? What are the ideas? I was listening to a Catholic philosopher, and he said that he thought homeschooling was now the new monasticism of the second dark ages. What are our kids being taught? What ideas are being taught? I would propose to you that many of our college students are being taught Marxist ideas, and they're not taught how to challenge those ideas. And I applaud the University of Chicago for standing up and saying, we're not going to have safe places. We're going to challenge you. Free inquiry. Here's Robert Hutchins. Some of you may know of Dr. Hutchins. Dr. Hutchins, by the way, was an associate of Mortimer Adler. Hutchins and Adler created the Great Books program at the University of Chicago many years ago. President Robert M. Hutchins responded that our students should have freedom to discuss any problem that presents itself. He insisted that the cure for ideas we oppose lies through open discussion rather than through inhibition. If you don't like an idea, you don't shout people down. You discuss it, you debate it. You show the strengths and the weaknesses. You show the pros and the cons. You go back and forth. If you'd like America to be a socialist nation, well, let's look at socialism. Let's look at what socialism has meant to other countries. Let's look at the strengths and the weaknesses. Let's debate capitalism. What are the strengths of capitalism? What are its weaknesses? How has it fared in the world? Let's debate the question of statues. Is it appropriate or inappropriate that a Confederate flag would fly over a state house? Statues of Confederate soldiers, should they be relegated to museums? Is that part of kind of the Southern tradition, or should they be put down? Or should we vote and put up some other statues? Let's debate this. But simply calling anybody you disagree with the R word, racism, it shuts down thought. It shuts down reflection. All those years ago, Robert Hutchins thought that the cure for ideas we oppose lies through open discussion rather than through inhibition. On a later occasion, Hutchins added that the free inquiry is indispensable to the good life, that universities exist for the sake of such inquiry, and that without it, they cease to be universities. Could I propose that a lot of our elite schools are no longer universities? They're propaganda mills. And that's tragic. But does it happen in our public schools? A noble learning experience illuminates the human condition and greatly enhances the human experience. And a lot of the things I've said to you this morning are found in my book, A World of Difference, or they're found in an article that I wrote on my Reflections blog. If you type in Reflections by Ken Samples, my blog will pop up. And in the last 10 years, I've written more than 500 articles on all kinds of topics. So Bob, I'm going to stop there, and I'm hoping we can have some lively Q&A.